I don't like endings, so I'll start at the beginning. In 1926, Alan Alexander Milne published Winnie the Pooh. It became a treasured and beloved story, especially thanks to the Disney adaptations. It's timeless, but was it meant to be immortal? What if you can't escape escapism? Maybe it should just stop. A. Milne, an essayist and playwright, based the characters on his son's collection of stuffed toys. A bear, a piglet, a donkey, a tiger, and a mother and child kangaroo. Milne himself invented two more characters, Owl and Rabbit, which is why they are depicted as real animals and not stuffed toys like his sons. The personalities evolved through playtime, particularly with Daphne Milne, the mother. And the son? The one who had the collection of teddies in the first place? His name was Christopher Robin. You might have noticed that he shares a name with the characters of the stories. How sweet! He named the fictional boy after his own son. Except, it might not really be a character. When you read the book, it's surprisingly autobiographical, and it opens with A. Milne talking in first person.
What about story? Said Christopher Robin. What about a story? I said. Could you very sweetly tell Winnie the Pooh one? I suppose I could, I said. What sort of stories does he like? About himself, because he's that sort of bear.
So this isn't a story about a boy named Christopher Robin. This is a story being told to the literal Christopher Robin.
Christopher Robin, you must shoot the balloon with your gun. Have you got your gun? Of course I have, you said. But if I do that, it will spoil the balloon, you said. But if you don't, said Pooh, I shall have to let go, and that would spoil me. When he put it like this, you saw how it was, and you aimed very carefully at the balloon and fired. Ow, said Pooh. Did I miss, you ask? Didn't exactly miss, said Pooh, but he missed the balloon.
And when the book ends, Christopher Robin is going back to bed. So this is A. Milne telling stories about his actual son and his collection of toys. And this had an impact on a child who was suddenly thrust into fame. His name was Christopher Milne. Yes, Robin is his middle name, not his surname. Christopher became the subject of a lot of his father's works. Before Winnie the Pooh, there was the short and stout Edward Bear in the poem Teddy Bear, and then in his more famous poem, Vespers.
Hush, hush, whisper who dares, Christopher Robin is saying his prayers.
A private moment cribbed and published with Christopher Robin's name permanently attached. This was published in Vanity Fair in 1923 and was eventually published in a poetry book along with Teddy Bear in 1924's When We Were Very Young. This sweet poem of prayer was said to have been framed in many people's homes and was hugely famous. Christopher Robin had become a household name, and he was barely 4. Then came Winnie the Pooh. He's still called Edward Bear to begin with, but he and the rest of the toy collection became superstars, with their real-life counterparts coming to inspire their characters, such as the neckline of the donkey toy becoming loose, thus making his head sag like it's depressed. The Milne family would regularly visit Ashdown Forest, and Christopher's games were going to inspire the stories almost verbatim. During one stormy day, Christopher Milne would place sticks in the dirt to measure how much the water was rising, and one blustery day, Christopher Robin did the same. Galleon's Lap, the Heffalump Trap, the Pooh Sticks Bridge, these are all real places. You can go to them. I was going to film a video there, but I couldn't afford the location fees. This makes the Pooh stories not a work of fiction, but a collection of memories, of the games and characters created partly by Christopher Milne. And in a manner, this is very sweet and endearing. It's a time capsule of a moment that a family can treasure forever. Many of our most beloved stories are inspired by the children around the author. The Mr. Men were created by Roger Hargreaves after his son had asked what a tickle looks like. There's nothing unusual about taking ideas from stories created with children and turning them into stories for all children. But perhaps Alan Milne's biggest error was that he took away his son's name and gave it to another boy. Christopher Milne was an early example of a child star, which was nice for a shy boy who found it hard to socialise. He then had to go to boarding school, and no matter what he did, Christopher Robin followed him everywhere he went. It's well known now the massively negative impact fame can have on child stars. Mara Wilson describes the overwhelming lack of privacy. Jeanette McCurdy endured a lot of pressure and abuse from her own mother. Macaulay Culkin was massively typecast. There's little protection from children being exploited as influencers on platforms like TikTok and YouTube. I've even already begun to scale back my son's inclusion online as he grows up in order to protect his right to privacy. Christopher Milne was not given that choice. He was relentlessly bullied and teased. He realized he could never live a normal life. The books may be finished, but he was still Christopher Robin, stuck as being forever this sweet little prayer boy who played with his teddy bear. All his most intimate moments were available everywhere, in all good bookstores. Christopher Milne spent his whole life trying to run away from Christopher Robin. The story wouldn't end. The invention of Winnie the Pooh is somewhat recreated in 2017's Goodbye Christopher Robin. Naturally, for a movie adaptation, it condenses and embellishes elements for it to be a more standard Hollywood plot. But perhaps the biggest alteration from reality is Christopher challenging his father over his inescapable fame.
You know, you did ask me to write a book for you.
A book for me, not about me.
This catharsis makes for good drama, but it didn't happen. In real life, it either had little impact on the family as a unit, or his father was just unaware of the effects it had on his son. When A.A. Milne died in 1956, Christopher never returned to that Sussex house near the woods. He had been still pretty close with his father, but after he married his cousin on his mother's side, yep, you heard that right, his cousin, the already strained relationship with his mother snapped, and she never spoke to her son again, even on her deathbed. He opened a bookstore, which is strange if he was trying to escape the fame of Winnie the Pooh that he'd openly invite book fans to see him. In 1987, Christopher Milne gave away the original toys. They now reside on display at the New York Public Library. People were horrified. Christopher Robin can't give away the toys. That's unthinkable. The boy gave away his bear because the boy wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man in his 60s. So, was Christopher Milne's life ruined by Christopher Robin? Would it have been better if it had just stopped? I'm not so sure Christopher would agree. For the longest time, he had refused to accept any of the Pooh royalty money. But when his daughter was born with cerebral palsy, he did eventually accept the money, but only to spend on his daughter to improve her life, not himself. I had to accept it for Claire's sake. In his autobiographies, he doesn't look back on the past with anger or regret. Embarrassment, sure, but he speaks so fondly of playing in the woods and being with his nanny. Memories of Pooh may be bittersweet, but revisiting the past allowed him to reconcile with it, saying that the process lifted me up from under the shadow of my father and of Christopher Robin. And to my surprise and pleasure, I found myself standing beside them in the sunshine, able to look both of them in the eye. Christopher Milne's story has an interesting parallel with Peter Llewellyn Davis, the boy who wouldn't grow up, Peter Pan. J.M. Barrie had informally adopted him and his brothers when their parents died, and wrote his namesake into the story along with his brothers, John and Michael. Being known as the real-life Peter Pan hounded him his entire life, that even when he committed suicide, the newspaper still referred to him as Peter Pan. And when Christopher Milne died in 1996, aged 75, he too was still referred to as his famous counterpart. I think that's why the 2018 Disney film Christopher Robin leaves a bad taste in my mouth. It's the fictional Christopher Robin, as evident by the Robin surname, but it borrows heavily from the actual life of Christopher Milne. Ashdown Forest, the house in Sussex and London, all grown up with a wife and daughter, although erasing her disability in the process. It's the story of the boy, all grown up to a man, a workaholic, straining the relationship with his family and has forgotten his childlike wonder until the reminder of his past shows up and, wait a minute, this is just Hook! Another Peter Pan reference? Except, instead of rediscovering his childlike wonder in a joyous, magical moment, Ewan McGregor rediscovers luggage.
And if we made the prices cheaper, well then everybody could afford to buy them.
Yeah. Good work, Disney. At the end of The House at Pooh Corner, the last of the two collections of Pooh stories, there's something of a lament. It's not explained how, but the characters are sensing Christopher Robin has to leave.
Christopher Robin was going away. Nobody knew why he was going. Nobody knew where he was going. Indeed, nobody even knew why he knew that Christopher Robin was going away.
The tone shifts. Instead of the carefree utopia where nothing bad happens, the characters are learning how to say goodbye. Poetry is often used as something of a love language in these stories, so they write their own poem. Each sign it and present it to him as a parting gift. Whilst Christopher Robin reads the poem, they quietly disappear, never to be seen again. Christopher Robin doesn't notice them go. Only Pooh is left. The pair take one last trip through the 100-acre woods to the enchanted place called Galleon's Lap. Christopher seems to be getting mournful and sulky, claiming to be going nowhere and wanting to do nothing. Then he info dumps onto Pooh stories of kings and queens and Europe and knights and Brazil. Real world things. Things from outside the 100-acre woods. This is startling because the 100-acre woods is an Arcadia, a harmonious and natural place like the Garden of Eden, a sort of paradise where there are no problems. The dilemmas are small scale, the fears are trivial. It's a place without corruption, cynicism or anger. Having fought in the First World War, Milne spoke out against it in 1934's Peace with Honour, something he later somewhat retracted in 1940's War with Honour. So perhaps the woods is also meant to represent a place where there is no war. Even in the Kingdom Hearts games, it's one of the only levels where there's no conflict. Maybe that's why these stories are so appealing and pleasant to revisit. It's a safe space and nothing can hurt you. Whilst this isn't the same thing as heaven in a Christian sense, Milne was probably more agnostic on this front, the concept does have a lot of crossover with some religious ideas for its serenity and peacefulness. But the woods is also a temporary place, and Christopher mentioning elements from outside the woods, it's a sign that he's been pulled away. He cannot stay anymore. He's growing up. Pooh doesn't understand what's happening. He's just happy to be with Christopher Robin.
Pooh, promise you won't forget about me, ever. Not even when I'm 100. Pooh thought for a little. How old shall I be then? 99. Pooh nodded. I promise, he said.
The 100-Acre Woods, this whole book in fact, encapsulates the magic and innocence of childhood and the tragedy that is learning to say goodbye to it, to leave it behind other than in memories. No matter what happens to Christopher Robin, a part of him, that joyous childlike wonder, will always remain in the 100-Acre Woods.
So they went off together, but wherever they go and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on the top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing.
Disney's The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, which amalgamates various chapters across both books, kinda botches the impact of this ending in a few ways.
In that enchanted place on top of the forest, a little bear will always be waiting.
Instead of always playing, he's always waiting, and the teddy winks. We don't get this sense of poignant goodbye, the heartfelt longing to stay, the permanency of the end, and the holding on to the treasured memories of childhood. It's not a goodbye, it's a see you later. And it's not even just Disney, because in 2009, the publishers just made a new book. They just made more books. Chapter 1, in which Christopher Robin returns. They made 4 additional books now, including one where Pooh meets the Queen. So much for stories of kings and queens in Brazil. You may recall earlier, of the animal friends I listed, someone was missing. And I don't mean Kessie or Lumpy. Perhaps you thought I forgot him. So, I will make up for that now. Obviously, the Disney adaptation is how most of us have heard of Winnie the Pooh, and Disney have made some fun and heartwarming stories out of him, but not without some alterations to the source material.
Going down?
Gopher is a character invented for the Disney adaptation. He isn't in the original story, and his character's introduction seems to reference this.
I'm not in the book, but I'm at your service.
His character seems to have been entirely lifted from the beaver in Lady and the Tramp 11 years prior, speech pattern included.
6'6" and 7/16 inches.
And, at least to begin with, he didn't really fit into the dynamic of the others. As mentioned before, the 100-Acre Woods is meant to be secluded from the outside world, but here's a gopher talking about money?
Do the job for hourly rate, plus cover materials, plus overtime, plus 10%.
This was an attempt to have a bigger personality as part of the ensemble, but the character did evolve over time. In the TV series, The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, he had a very prominent role where he's more of a workaholic pyromaniac. But since A Very Merry Pooh Year in 2002, Gopher's role has been reduced to minor appearances and cameos, barely seen or mentioned again. So, why was he here in the first place? According to the film's director, Wolfgang Reifferman, Disney had wanted to add more of a folksy, all-American grassroots image to appeal to an American audience, and perhaps more controversially, to replace Piglet.
Looks like there's gonna be a swinging.
Oh, dear.
You see, when Disney adapted Winnie the Pooh into a film, they didn't begin with a feature film. Originally, it was a featurette, a short film called Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, and it was attached to the 1966 movie The Ugly Dachshund, and it was pretty well received. Not The Ugly Dachshund, no. In America, audiences enjoyed it thanks to the direction of making it more Americanized and adding more comedy. But in the UK, it had more of a mixed reception. Winnie the Pooh illustrator E.H. Shepard called the film a complete travesty. Many balked at the Disney changes, and when the second Pooh featurette, The Blustery Day, was made, Piglet was added back in and has remained ever since. Eventually, the 3 Winnie the Pooh featurettes were spliced together to form the 1977 movie The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, with the added ending I mentioned before. But at least, Piglet had his place restored as Pooh's best friend. But was this really what the author intended? According to Angela Milne, the niece of A.A. Milne, she recalls a story of the real-life Christopher Robin discovering a creature in the woods that might have been an escaped gopher from Brighton Docks. So a gopher was written into the manuscript, aka the Gopher draft. This larger-than-life American character had to be removed, as you will confine the appeal to a handful of illiterates munching hamburgers. Hey, I'm just quoting here. Don't shoot the messenger. Please don't, you have a lot of guns. But as for the empty parts of the book left when the Gopher character was removed, it was suggested by the publishers to use the minor character of Piglet to fill the Gopher gap. This is mind-blowing. Piglet originally replaced Gopher, and in an absolute clairvoyant fluke, Disney then replaced Piglet with Gopher, the same animal. That's amazing. That's impossible. That sounds too good to be true. Oh, bother. Alan Milne nor Christopher Milne mention a gopher in their autobiographies. The published original manuscript makes no mention of a gopher either. So let's look at Angela Milne's article again. It adds that the other characters were rewritten to have American accents as well, and A.A. Milne himself started saying, "How come you ain't wearing your paper Dr. Dodger bag?" Let me try that again. A.A. Milne himself started saying, "How come you ain't wearing your paper Brooklyn Dodgers cap?" It's a joke. A statement of how Pooh being Americanized by saying it was always meant to be Americanized. Angela Milne is Alan Milne's niece, but this is a parody article for Punch magazine. Think of it like a paper version of The Onion. It's a publication that Alan Milne has also written for in the past. But to be extra thorough, I did scan through past newspapers for any news story of an escaped gopher and found nothing. Sorry, TV tropes. We were tricked.
After all, he's not in the book, you know.
Disney have taken the stories and massively altered them for an American audience. This was and remains to be a massively successful move, and I personally enjoy them very much. They retain the spirit and charm of the books, but at the same time, the changes were divisive, and the corporate Disneyfication of Winnie the Pooh was in many ways personified by a gopher. Then things got messy. Pooh has had his fair share of legal troubles. In 1980, a character actor was accused of intentionally assaulting a 10-year-old girl who had surprised the actor from behind. Clearly an accident, but it meant that the actor had to demonstrate how the costume lacked the dexterity needed to strike someone with any power. Disney have super strict rules on actors putting on the costume and not shattering the illusion for anyone, no matter where they are. So, not only did the actor have to stand trial in costume, but in character. Winnie the Pooh has officially stood trial. He answered questions with head nods, foot stomps, and dancing on the spot.
Have the record show that he's doing a two-step.
Anyway, by the 1990s, the Pooh brand was bringing in $1 billion a year, which led to one of Disney's longest-running lawsuits.
Exhibit A.
Disney had bought the Pooh merchandising rights from Steven Schlesinger Incorporated, aka SSI. But in 1991, Disney was sued for outstanding royalties, leading to a case that ran for 18 years. This got real scrappy. Disney at one point destroyed more than 40 boxes of Pooh paperwork, including one marked Winnie the Pooh legal problems. Why would you label a box that? That's like carrying around a folder for all the murders what I've done. At one point, SSI hired private detectives to go through Disney's trash searching for evidence. The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh ended in 1991, the year the lawsuit began, and throughout the 90s there were a lot of repeats, which made it Pooh's most lucrative years at Disney. But little of that was actually new material, other than some straight to VHS releases. And it's not surprising given that this court case had millions, maybe billions of dollars on the line for Disney, so they were probably cautious of creating more money they might have to give away. By 2009, the lawsuit was over, and Disney now owned Winnie the Pooh entirely, but the damage was done. Disney made the 2011 Winnie the Pooh movie, which was meant to be a revival of the Pooh franchise, but by this point CG animation had taken over. So the franchise once again went dormant, with one last gasp attempt in 2018's live-action Christopher Robin, and a 2014 pilot by Cartoon Saloon that never got picked up. So why was there a last-minute rush for Winnie the Pooh all of a sudden? Under US copyright law, one of the ways works enters the public domain is after 95 years from its first publication. So Winnie the Pooh entered public domain in 2022. The characters, the artwork, even Christopher Robin himself. Even though the Disney-specific image of Pooh in a red shirt won't be public domain until 2027, Pooh going public domain will have a big impact on Disney. But they're probably more worried right now about Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie becoming public domain very, very soon. So after all that, despite years of squabbling and mudslinging, Pooh belongs to no one now. And people were free to make their own spin on the beloved characters. Such as Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey is not a good movie, and you are not surprised by this. Once the rights of Winnie the Pooh went public domain, a horror movie based on the IP was rushed out. We've had the kid thing turned horror thing before with the Banana Splits movie, Choo Choo Charles, that one about the Grinch, Krampus too, kinda. There's a plethora that borrow from the uncanny, kid-friendly aesthetic for horror purposes, like the alluring, haunting aura of an abandoned Disney ride. To an extent, you can say that Child's Play, Annabelle, Megan, or even It does this, recontextualizing kid-friendly things like children's dolls and clowns into horror. So the premise is nothing new. This premise is that Pooh's characters are not teddies, but in fact animal-like abominations that Christopher Robin befriends. But he grows up and has to leave, just like the book, but unable to fend for themselves, they become so starved and feral, they eat Eeyore and swear to kill any humans that enter the woods. For something unable to fend for themselves, they sure seem pretty good at fending for themselves. Plus, it's just a dude in a mask. Like, come on! There's nothing animalistic about this. It's just Michael Myers if he was painted yellow. This tacks on the Pooh name, but does nothing with it. Like at one point, Pooh runs over someone with a car. What does that have to do with Winnie the Pooh? Nothing. That doesn't count. Shut up. It doesn't actually take that much effort to use Winnie the Pooh material in a horror context. You could have him be a living bear, like Chucky. Pooh makes traps, like for the heffalumps. That's an easy one. It's just a hole. In the film, he kind of commands a swarm of bad CGI bees, like a bee bender. Why not submerge someone's head in bees? I don't even like horror movies that much, but even I can come up with plenty of ideas that are just loosely inspired from the source material. But they don't care. Look, I'm not against the idea of genre-bending reinterpretations like horror, but people only watch this film because it has Winnie the Pooh's name on it. It is devoid of imagination to cohesively work Pooh and horror together in anything other than lip service. And now we're getting a sequel and a Christopher Robin horror TV show. Fantastic. It reeks of shallow cynicism, greedy opportunism, and they don't even have the audacity to make it any good. Hasn't this gone on long enough?
An introduction is to introduce people, but Christopher Robin and his friends, who have already been introduced to you, are now going to say goodbye. So this is the opposite. When we asked Pooh what the opposite of an introduction was, he said, "The what of the what?" Which didn't help us as much as we had hoped. But luckily, Al kept his head and told us that the opposite of an introduction, my dear Pooh, was a contradiction. Now, this is very good at long words. I'm sure that that's what it is.
I don't like endings. I have a lot of discomfort when it comes to endings. I don't know, it's that sense of finality when something is over and that's it. That's terrifying. I've stayed in friendships and jobs for longer than I should have. Even dwelling on my own mortality, even for a moment, floods me with panic. The permanence of an ending upsets me so much I have sticker sheets that I will never use because I can't commit to where they'll go. I don't like endings, but I like endings in stories. It's a contradiction. There's a lot of talk of shows that have gone on for way too long. The Simpsons is a classic example, but it's obviously still an incredibly popular show. Just because I've stopped watching it, who am I to take that away from anyone else?
Have no fear. Safety is here.
And yet, shows that build up to a predetermined ending is so satisfying, like Gravity Falls. It was always intended to be 2 seasons to reflect that summer break, and it's over. I'm sad it's gone, but I'll be sadder if it gets more episodes because that would undercut the importance of an ending. A thing is only beautiful because it's temporary. We can't stay in the woods forever. Should Winnie the Pooh have carried on beyond the ending? These stories have been a source of huge comfort to a lot of people around the world, unless you're the president of China. It's meditative and serene. It's uncomplicated. It's nice. I don't want to take that away, but isn't a story stronger with an ending? This has been an overcomplicated and painful mess. It should stop. Is this what Alan Milne wanted when he ended the story, for it to just carry on ad nauseum? Let's look at that ending one more time, but from another perspective. Alan Milne wasn't thrilled that Pooh would overshadow his body of work, but Christopher Milne describes his father as someone very nostalgic.
My father, who had derived such happiness from his childhood, found in me the companion with whom he could return there.
And this sense of reliving childhood manifested in several ways. In his written works, who the boy actually represents is interchangeable.
The Christopher Robin who appears in so many of the poems is not always me, so sometimes my father is using it to describe something I did, and sometimes he is borrowing it to describe something he did as a child.
Christopher also notes of a trip to a particular restaurant, taking a particular route with a particular bus because it was a routine, all part of the memory for Alan Milne, of going there as a young boy with his older brother, Kenneth Milne.
And when the holidays were over and I was back at school, his first letter to me would recall that happy lunch that he and I had had together. He and I and the ghost of Ken.
Alan Milne was very close to his brother. They were both poets and often collaborated together. Alan may have been the more talented of the pair, but it was never a source of resentment. They were a huge part of each other's lives, inseparable. As Christopher grew up, he said,
"But he, I now suspect, saw me as a sort of twin brother, perhaps a sort of reincarnation of Ken."
Looking at this ending, it's unusual for Christopher Robin to feel the need to say goodbye to Pooh. For Christopher, this sense of permanency, of this farewell, feels weighty for a carefree boy like him. In this moment, is this really Christopher Robin speaking? Or is it Alan Milne? Throughout this journey, yes, Pooh would have adventures on his own, but Pooh, like the animal friends, finds warmth in Christopher Robin. He looks up to Christopher Robin like a protector, a comfort, a guide. Christopher Robin knows what to do. Pooh adores him, and he adores him back. They need each other. In this way, the boy and the bear are like siblings. Christopher Milne had no siblings.
So they went off together, but wherever they go, and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on the top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing.
Through the 1920s, when Christopher was born and Pooh was being written, Alan's brother Ken was dying of tuberculosis. The inseparable brothers were separated, unable to see each other as often anymore. When House at Pooh Corner was finally published, Alan's brother Ken died the following year, aged just 49. Christopher Milne may not have had much sentiment for his commercialised childhood, which is entirely reasonable, but if Alan Milne had found joy and comfort reliving his childhood vicariously through his son, and in turn, Christopher Robin, then maybe that enchanted place on top of the forest is more for him than for anyone else. A place where there's no war, no illness, no death. A place where a boy and his bear, or a pair of brothers, will always be playing for as long as they want. And it never has to stop. I don't like endings, but I like this ending. For a chunk of this video, I discussed Winnie the Pooh as an adaptation. And when there's such love for the original book, there's always going to be someone upset at the changes made, such as Christopher Robin's original American accent.
What are you looking for, Pooh Bear?
Sparking a massive UK newspaper campaign until Disney released a British dub shortly afterwards.
Silly old bear. Silly old bear.
And this is just Winnie the Pooh. Imagine how hard something as complex as Lord of the Rings must have been to adapt. How do you split the books into standalone movies? How do you structure the order of events? And what the f*** do you even do with Tom Bombadil? Actually, Lindsay Ellis has made a video all about the adaptation of Lord of the Rings, and not just its good points, but it's not on YouTube. It is exclusively on Nebula, who are also the sponsors of this video. Nebula is my video streaming platform that is creator-made and creator-owned, so by simply signing up, it directly supports me and creators like me. It has exclusive originals, bonus content, and no ads. Plus, there's much less risk of YouTube's overzealous copyright strikes. Speaking of which, if, like me, you find copyright really confusing, then Legal Eagle has everything you need to know about copyright laws and how to protect yourself from copyright claims, which is part of Nebula classes. A bonus feature you get just for signing up to Nebula. So we can all learn something, even if you're a bear of very little brain, which Disney can't sue me for because now I know about copyright. Thanks, Nebula. All my video essays are also on Nebula, ad-free, and many with brand new epilogues to cover new information since the video's original upload. So get Nebula using the link in the description for 40% off an annual subscription. And that really is the end.
Oh, bother.
Special shout out to this month's patrons, including Ashley Kinder, Trey Brock, Sloan Schoolcraft, Jay Slynn, Vinny Vex, Drifter Wolf, Double X Studios, Beamer Tectonic, Eustace Jack, Moel Kasemi, Setsune Wave, Glenn Sugden, Rusty Robot, Pappy Fop, Louis Wild, Michael Elton, James Owen, Nathan Charwinati, Matthew Smith, Clem Wamsley, Alex Weston, Joel Jennings, Brett Halford, Harvey Mill 5 Guys, Blaze Launcher NG, and Aaron is Chummy. And if you would like to support me, then please consider doing so on Patreon.